It happened in late October, one of those nights where the chill in the air seems to settle into your bones, making you feel uneasy for no apparent reason. My family had just moved into this old house on the outskirts of town. It had been abandoned for years, and we figured it would be a perfect place to start fresh, a new life away from the busy city. We didn't care about the rumors or the strange history the locals whispered about. To us, it was just an old house that needed some work. That first night, the wind howled through the trees, and the branches scraped against the windows like bony fingers. My parents were downstairs unpacking, while my little brother, Daniel, was already in bed. I was in my room, struggling to fall asleep. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the house settling, seemed louder than it should be. Something about the place felt off. I kept telling myself it was just because it was new, unfamiliar. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. It started around midnight. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when I heard the front door creak open. At first, I thought it was just my dad going out for some air. But then there was this heavy, dragging sound, like someone was pulling something across the floor. I sat up, heart pounding in my chest. The noise stopped, replaced by silence so thick it pressed down on me. Then, out of nowhere, Daniel screamed. Daniel was sitting up in bed, his eyes wide with terror, pointing toward the window. "What's wrong?" my mom asked, her voice shaky. "There was a man," Daniel whispered, still pointing. "He was right there, watching me." We all stared at the window, but there was nothing outside except the swaying trees and the shadows they cast. My dad muttered something about it being a nightmare and shut the window tight. We tried to brush it off, but none of us slept well that night. There was a tension in the air, a sense that something was waiting, lurking just outside the edge of our understanding. The next few days were a blur of restless nights and strange occurrences. Footsteps in the hallway when no one was there. Whispers in the middle of the night, so faint you couldn't make out the words. And that feeling, that overwhelming sensation of being watched, followed us everywhere we went in the house. Then, on the fourth night, it happened. It was well past midnight, and the house had settled into an eerie quiet. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when I heard it again. That soft creak of the front door. My blood turned to ice. I lay there, barely breathing, listening. This time, the dragging sound was more distinct, and it was closer, much closer. I sat up slowly, straining to hear. My bedroom door was slightly ajar, and through the crack, I saw movement. Just a shadow at first, something dark and slow, moving along the hallway. My heart raced. Then I heard it, a low, raspy breathing. Not human. It was too slow, too deliberate, and it was coming toward Daniel's room. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything, but I was frozen in place, paralyzed by fear. The shadow stopped outside Daniel's door, and I saw it, just for a split second. A pale, gaunt face peering into his room. Eyes that gleamed like wet stones. Mouth twisted into a terrible smile that revealed sharp, gleaming teeth. The door creaked as it opened, and I snapped out of my daze. I rushed toward Daniel's room, adrenaline surging through me, and flung the door open. But by then, it was too late. The figure was standing over Daniel's bed, its long, skeletal fingers brushing against his cheek. Daniel's face was pale, his eyes fluttering as if he were trapped in some horrible dream. I screamed, and the creature turned to look at me. Its eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. It was tall, impossibly tall, its frame draped in tattered, black clothing that seemed to move on its own, like shadows curling around it. Its skin was white, almost translucent, and its eyes, those hollow, endless eyes, were filled with a hunger that made my stomach turn. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. It bared its teeth, and in one swift motion, it lunged at me. I stumbled back, crashing into the wall as it reached out, its cold fingers brushing against my skin. But before it could grab hold of me, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hall, my dad rushing toward us. The creature hissed, a low, guttural sound, and in an instant, it was gone, just vanished like smoke fading into the air. My dad burst into the room, frantic, and all I could do was point to the window. He looked at me, eyes wide, as if waiting for an explanation. But what could I say? I was still shaking, unable to form words. We stood there for a long moment, the room filled with this awful silence, broken only by the wind whispering through the open window. Daniel stirred in his bed, groaning softly, still pale but alive. The color hadn't quite returned to his face. My dad rushed over to him, checking for any signs of injury, but there were none. At least none that we could see. I saw something, I finally whispered, my voice barely audible. It was standing right here over him. I don't know what it was, but my dad cut me off, shaking his head. It was a nightmare. We're all on edge because of this place. That's all. But I could see it in his eyes. He didn't believe what he was saying. His hands were still shaking as he closed the window and locked it, and he kept glancing around the room as if expecting something to leap out of the shadows. He wanted to believe it was just our imaginations, but deep down, he knew. That night, we didn't sleep. My mom sat in the living room, clutching the phone, but we didn't call anyone. What would we even say? And there was something else, a gnawing feeling in my gut that no one would believe us if we tried. Morning came, gray and cold. It did nothing to shake off the dread that clung to us. My parents decided we needed to get out of the house, even if just for a little while, so we packed up the car and headed into town. It was supposed to be a distraction, but the whole time, I couldn't stop looking over my shoulder, expecting to see that pale face lurking somewhere in the crowd. The day dragged on, thick with tension. My parents were quiet, and Daniel was distant, like he hadn't fully woken up from whatever dream or nightmare had trapped him the night before. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed, though every time I turned around, there was nothing there. Just the usual hustle and bustle of town life, people going about their business, unaware of the shadow that had crept into our lives. It wasn't until we got back to the house that evening that things took a darker turn. The air felt different, thicker, like the house itself was holding its breath. My mom was the first to step inside, and I'll never forget the way she froze, her hands still on the doorknob, her face draining of all color. "What is that?" she whispered. I followed her gaze and my stomach dropped. Scrawled across the living room wall, in jagged, claw-like marks, were words. 3 words. "I am here." The letters were etched deep into the wood, as if something had raked its nails across the surface with inhuman strength. My dad cursed under his breath and immediately went to inspect the rest of the house, while my mom stood there, staring at the wall like she couldn't comprehend what she was seeing. I wanted to tell myself it was a prank, that someone had broken in while we were gone. But deep down, I knew better. This wasn't human. Couldn't be. We should have left right then, packed up the car and never looked back. But fear has a way of making you rationalize the irrational. My dad tried to calm us down, saying it was probably just some local kids messing with us. He boarded up the windows that night, double-checked the locks, and assured us that everything would be fine. But it wasn't. Around midnight, the house began to creak and groan like it was alive. The sound wasn't just coming from the walls. It was deeper, as if the very foundation of the house was shifting, trembling beneath us. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, every muscle in my body tense. I was waiting for it, and then I heard it, a faint tapping, Not at the window this time, but from the floorboards. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, like something was crawling beneath the house, searching, scraping against the wood. It stopped directly under my bed. Couldn't breathe. I felt this icy grip wrap around my chest, squeezing tighter and tighter until I thought I might pass out. Then, slowly, the sound shifted. Whatever it was began to rise through the walls. I could hear it now, the scratching, dragging sound moving up the walls like something clawing its way to the surface. I bolted upright just as the door to my room creaked open. There, standing in the doorway, was Daniel. His eyes were wide, but there was something wrong with them. They were too dark, too empty. His lips parted, but no words came out. Instead, he lifted his arm and pointed toward the window, the same window where I'd seen the creature the first time. "It's here," he whispered, his voice flat, hollow. "It's coming back." And then I saw it, a shadow moving just beyond the glass, twisted, hunched, like it had to bend itself unnaturally to fit into the small frame of the window. Its eyes, those terrible gleaming eyes, locked onto mine, and for a moment, everything in me went cold. I reached for Daniel, pulling him back from the window, but he didn't resist. He just stood there, eyes glazed over, staring into the night like he was under some kind of spell. I slammed the window shut, but the thing outside didn't move. It just stared, its mouth curling into that same awful smile. And then, the tapping started again. This time it was at the door. We weren't alone in that house, and now there was no escaping it. I stood there, frozen, with Daniel in my grip, staring at the window. The vampire, the creature, pressed itself against the glass, its smile widening, revealing those unnaturally sharp teeth. Its pale face distorted, shifting in the moonlight, making it seem both human and inhuman at the same time. The tapping at the door grew louder, more insistent, like nails dragging along the wood. Panic surged through me. My heart pounded in my chest, every instinct screaming at me to run, to get Daniel and myself out of there. But I couldn't leave my parents. I had to protect them. I had to try. Gripping Daniel's hand tightly, I dragged him out of the room and down the hall. He was limp like a puppet, barely responsive, but at least he followed. The scratching sound behind us grew louder, like it was chasing us. I reached the staircase just as my mom came rushing up, her face pale with terror. "What's happening?" she gasped, grabbing my shoulders. "Where's your dad?" I hadn't even realized he wasn't with us. He'd gone to check the rest of the house, but I hadn't seen him since. Before I could answer, there was a crash downstairs, the unmistakable sound of glass shattering. My mom let out a short, horrified cry and ran toward the noise, calling for my dad. I wanted to stop her, but I knew there wasn't time. The vampire was inside. I forced Daniel to follow me downstairs, my heart pounding in my ears. The air in the house felt thick, suffocating, as if the very walls were closing in on us. We reached the living room, where my mom stood frozen, staring in horror at the broken window. There, crouched in the middle of the room, was the vampire. It was hunched over, its black, tattered cloak fluttering as if caught in a wind only it could feel. Its limbs were long and grotesque, twisting at unnatural angles as it slowly rose to its full height. My dad was against the far wall, clutching a heavy iron fire poker in both hands, his face white with fear. The vampire's eyes gleamed in the dim light, and its smile spread wider, revealing rows of sharp teeth. It moved slowly, deliberately, as if savoring the fear radiating from. "We need to get out." Her eyes locked on the creature. I knew we didn't have time. We couldn't escape through the front door. It was too close. And the window, that was out of the question. The creature lunged. My dad swung the fire poker, the heavy iron clanging against the vampire's arm. But it didn't even flinch. It moved with impossible speed, grabbing the poker and wrenching it out of his hands like it was nothing. My dad stumbled back, tripping over a chair, crashing to the floor. The vampire was on him in a flash, its hands wrapping around his throat, lifting him off the ground as if he weighed nothing. I screamed, grabbing the first thing I could find, a wooden chair, and hurled it at the creature. It barely reacted. The vampire's eyes flicked toward me, and for the first time, I saw the depth of its hunger. Its smile faded, replaced by a look of cold, unrelenting malice. It dropped my dad, who crumpled to the floor gasping for air, and turned its full attention to me. I couldn't move. My legs felt like they were made of lead. It stalked toward me, each step slow and deliberate, as if it knew I had no way of stopping it. Just as it was about to reach me, my mom snapped out of her daze. She rushed forward, a kitchen knife in her hand, and slashed at the vampire's back. The blade made contact, slicing through its cloak and into its flesh. But instead of blood, a thick, dark smoke hissed from the wound. The vampire let out a high-pitched, ear-splitting screech, spinning around with inhuman speed. Its hand lashed out, catching my mom across the chest, sending her flying into the wall with a sickening thud. She crumpled to the floor, unmoving. "No!" I screamed, rushing to her side, my hands trembling. She was breathing, but barely. The vampire turned back to me, and I knew this was it. There was no escape. But then, something in Daniel shifted. He'd been standing still this whole time, eyes glazed over, trapped in that strange daze. But now, his head snapped up, and for the first time since this nightmare began, he looked fully aware. His eyes locked onto the vampire, and without a word, he stepped forward. I tried to stop him. "Daniel, no!" But he didn't listen. He moved with a calmness that terrified me even more than the vampire itself. The creature paused, its eyes narrowing as it regarded Daniel. Something passed between them, something silent but heavy. And then the vampire hissed, a sound of pure rage. It lunged at Daniel, its claws extended, but Daniel didn't flinch. Instead, he raised his hand, and the vampire stopped mid-air, as if it had hit an invisible wall. The air around us seemed to vibrate, and the creature howled in frustration, struggling against whatever force was holding it back. I stared at Daniel, my mind racing. How was he doing this? But there was no time for answers. The vampire let out a final, deafening screech, and in a sudden burst of speed, it broke free. It slashed at Daniel, its claws raking across his chest. Daniel stumbled back, collapsing to the floor, gasping in pain. The vampire turned its gaze back to me, but now its movements were slower, more erratic. The wound from the knife still oozed that strange, smoky vapor, and it was clearly weakening. Desperate, I grabbed the fire poker my dad had dropped and swung it with every ounce of strength I had. The creature staggered, its body dissolving into a dark mist that writhed and twisted in the air. I hit it again and again until the mist thinned, losing shape. With a final, tortured scream, the vampire collapsed into a pile of ash, its presence vanishing into the night. The house was still, too still. I dropped the poker, shaking, and ran to Daniel's side. His eyes were open, but his breathing was shallow. My dad crawled over, clutching his throat, bruised but alive. My mom was still unconscious, but her chest rose and fell in weak, steady breaths. I don't know how long we stayed there, huddled together, staring at the spot where the vampire had disappeared. I don't know how Daniel had stopped it, or what the creature had done to him. All I knew was that we had survived, barely. But as I looked into Daniel's And deep down, I knew that the creature wasn't truly gone. It had left its mark. The days after the attack blurred together into a haze of fear, pain, and confusion. We stayed in the house, unable to leave, as if something still held us there, tethering us to the nightmare that had nearly destroyed us. My mom, battered but alive, woke hours after the fight, disoriented and terrified. The first thing she did was ask about Daniel, and when she saw him, pale and weak, but breathing, she cried like I'd never seen before. My dad, despite the bruises on his neck, busied himself with taking care of her and keeping the house locked down. He refused to leave Daniel's side, never mentioning the vampire, as if saying its name might bring it back. But none of us could forget. Daniel's wounds were shallow, too shallow it seemed, for the amount of pain he was in. The scratches on his chest weren't deep, but they festered in a way that shouldn't have happened. The skin around the cuts darkened, the veins around them turning an unnatural shade of purple. He was feverish, sometimes delirious, and his eyes weren't the same. There was a depth to them now, a darkness that had never been there before. It was almost like the vampire had left a piece of itself inside him. We didn't go to the hospital. We couldn't explain what had happened, and we feared the questions more than the wounds themselves. Instead, we treated him at home. My mom cleaned the cuts daily, her hands shaking as she wiped away the dark, oily discharge that seeped from them. My dad didn't say much. He just watched Daniel, his eyes hollow, as if he was waiting for something terrible to happen. And then, slowly, Daniel began to change. At first, it was subtle. He slept longer, ate less, and he seemed distant, like his mind was somewhere far away. He would stare out the window for hours, watching the woods, his face expressionless. But then, as the days passed, he stopped sleeping altogether. He'd sit in his room at night, awake and alert, his eyes wide and unblinking. His skin, already pale from the attack, grew even lighter, almost translucent. And his voice? It became quieter, more detached, like he wasn't entirely there. But the worst part was the cold. Whenever I touched him, he felt freezing. Not like he was just cold from being sick, but a deep, unnatural cold, like something dead. I didn't want to admit it to myself, but I knew. The vampire hadn't just hurt Daniel. It had infected him, somehow left a part of its darkness inside him. And whatever that darkness was, it was growing. One night, a few weeks after the attack, I woke to the sound of footsteps. At first, I thought it was my dad. He'd taken to pacing the house late at night, checking the windows and doors obsessively. But these footsteps were lighter, slower. I sat up in bed, listening, and then I heard the creak of my door opening. Daniel was standing in the doorway. Daniel? He didn't respond. He just stared at me, his eyes wide and empty, the same way he had looked that night when the vampire had first appeared. For a moment, I thought he was sleepwalking, but then he smiled. A slow, eerie smile that sent a chill down my spine. "I'm hungry," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know how to react. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what he had just said. But before I could respond, he turned and walked out of the room. I followed him, my heart pounding in my chest, down the stairs and into the kitchen. Daniel stood by the window, staring out at the woods, his breath fogging up the glass. And that's when I saw them. Eyes gleaming, red eyes in the darkness, watching from the edge of the tree line. I froze. There, just beyond the shadows of the trees, was the same figure, the vampire. It hadn't left. It had been waiting, biding its time. And now it was back. "Daniel, we have to go. Now." But he didn't move. He just kept staring out the window, his voice low and distant. "It's calling me." Cold knot formed in my stomach. "What do you mean?" He turned to me, his eyes dark, hollow, and so far removed from the brother I once knew. I can hear it, in my head. It's calling me to come. Like it now. I shook my head, stepping back, but Daniel grabbed my wrist, his grip ice cold. Don't you see? It didn't die. It can't die. I pulled away from him, tears stinging my eyes. No, you're still Daniel. You're still my brother. We can fix this. We'll figure it out. But deep down, I knew there was no fixing it. The vampire's curse had taken hold of him, slowly transforming him into something else, something not human. Just then, my dad appeared in the kitchen, his face ashen. He had heard everything. We need to leave, he said quietly, his voice shaking. Now? But Daniel didn't move. He just stared at us, his expression unreadable. You can't leave. It won't let you. The cold finality of his words sent a shiver down my spine. My dad stepped forward, reaching for Daniel, but he backed away, his eyes flickering with a strange, unnatural light. And then, with a speed that was impossible, he darted toward the back door, flinging it open. The wind howled through the house as he ran out into the night, disappearing into the woods where the vampire waited. I screamed his name, but it was no use. He was gone. For days we waited. We searched the woods, calling out for Daniel, but there was no sign of him. My parents were shattered, my dad blaming himself for not stopping the vampire when he had the chance. My mom withdrew, barely speaking, her eyes hollow from crying. We all knew, deep down, that Daniel wasn't coming back, not as the brother we knew. Weeks passed, and the house felt more like a tomb. Then, one night, while we were huddled together in the living room, the tapping began again. At first, it was soft, barely audible. But then it grew louder, more insistent, coming from the windows, the walls, the floors. My dad grabbed the fire poker again, his knuckles white, as we stood frozen, waiting. And then, from outside, I heard his voice. Let me in. It was Daniel, but it wasn't. His voice was wrong. Too calm, too cold. And behind it, I could hear the faintest echo of the vampire's hiss. We have to go, my dad whispered, grabbing my arm. Now? But as we moved toward the door, the tapping grew louder, surrounding us. And from outside, Daniel's voice came again, softer this time, more insistent. Let me in. We didn't let him in that night, but I know he's still out there, waiting, watching, and someday he'll find a way back inside. We have nowhere left to go. The vampire's curse is closing in on us, and I don't know if we'll survive the next night. Every window feels like it's watching, every creak in the floor like a breath held too long. I've written everything I can, everything that's happened to us, but the feeling that it's all about to end never leaves me. Daniel's voice outside the door, that constant tapping. It's only a matter of time. Whatever waits for us tonight, I don't know if we'll make it through. The end is coming. I can feel it. The house is silent now, but the quiet feels wrong, like it's holding its breath, waiting. I don't know how much time we have left. Daniel's voice still calls from the darkness, closer every night. We've locked every door, barred every window, but it doesn't matter. There's nowhere to hide. Whatever comes for us, it's only a matter of time. We're trapped here, and the fear is suffocating. I don't think we'll see another dawn. The night presses in heavier than before. Each second feels like it's dragging us closer to something inevitable. I can still hear the tapping and Daniel's voice. Faint, but there, just outside. We've tried everything to keep it out, but the walls feel thinner now, like they're giving in. I don't know how much longer we can hold on. Whatever's out there is coming for us, and there's no escaping it. I can feel it creeping closer. I just hope I've written enough before the end finds us. They're already in the house. I can hear them moving through the walls, the shadows twisting around us. There's nowhere left to run. God help us, we won't survive the night. I can feel their cold presence now, closing in, each breath harder to take. The air is thick with something wrong, something ancient. They're here, just beyond the door. God help us. They're coming.